Home ownership is a unique journey in one's life. And it's got so many twists and turns and situations and pitfalls that can just spring up all of a sudden during the entire process. From the initial, looking online and looking at the various houses and looking at pictures of them to see what you like and what you don't, to actually going in person and discovering that the photographer for those online ads needs a raise because he made it look way better than it actually was in person. Then it's finding the house. But then you got to go through all the financing things, which is just so much more uncomfortable than it ought to be because so many different people have to look at your finances and go through it with a fine-tooth comb and wonder, why did you spend $150 at a comic book shop? Mind your business, Craig. But you have all these different things going on. Then you got the home inspection, and then you get those last second, wait, what's this kind of moments? Until finally the moment the keys are in your hands. And it's kind of hard to describe whether or not that feeling that you get when that key is in your hand, if that's excitement about finally owning the home, or if it's relief because the process of getting that home is over. But really, that's just when the fun is getting started. Right? Mandy and I are on our third go-around of home ownership, and if I have anything to say about the situation, it's our last one for a while. I really hope that you all are in for the long haul because I don't want to move again. So I'm hoping you stick with me. But our discovery of just how much more interesting actually owning the home is really took place the day that we moved in. See, when you buy a house, you're not just getting a roof and some walls, you're also inheriting all the little repairs or lack thereof that the previous owners have done to the house. And the day we moved in to our first house was really an interesting day because the house that we bought did not come with a refrigerator. So we had to purchase one ourselves, and we'd worked it out to where the fridge was actually going to be delivered the same day that we moved in. We had some stuff from our refrigerator from the home that we were renting at the time that we wanted to make sure that we got to keep. Things like chicken wings. I love chicken wings. Got some in the freezer. It's going to be a fun afternoon. Anyway, but we discovered that the outlet that the refrigerator plugged into only worked when the light was on in the laundry room. That was fun. And then there was discovering that the outside lights, when we replaced the bulb, if we tightened it just right, we killed the outlets in the girls' bedroom. My personal favorite from the first home, though, was discovering that the overflow part of your bathtub, that little thing that's got a knob there that's supposed to be there to catch any water that might get over there, wasn't hooked up properly. We discovered that one night when Mandy decided to take a nice relaxing bath, and all of a sudden it started raining in the downstairs bathroom. What a fun night that was. Our home before the one that we currently live in, we called it the 2020 home. And we didn't call it the 2020 home just because that was the year that we bought it. We called it that because almost every home repair that we did in that house, I would not have had to do had the previous owner spent 20 more minutes and $20 more. And then it would have been done right in the first place, and I could have saved at least a little bit of my hairline. Let's take it from the wire that ran to our septic system. It ran the pump that was inside of that septic pump. It was, for some reason, tied into the AC unit. When it was only about 10 feet from our breaker, we just needed 10 more feet of wire, and it would have been done right. Then there was our home generator, which was a really nice feature, and we were really glad to have it, especially when it came to the resale time. But we discovered the only time that it ever was on in the 4 years that we lived there, that it wasn't installed quite right. Because once it kicked on, it wouldn't kick off. And it took 3 technicians 9 hours to discover that all that needed to happen was when they installed it in the first place, they needed to expose a little bit more wire and tighten it about 3 more turns. I spent so much money to find that out. And then there was even just discovering that the front door and several of the windows had not been properly insulated. Literally a $10 can of spray foam insulation saved us hundreds of dollars on our gas bill in the wintertime. Homeownership is fun. So far, currently in our current house, we've not had any of these major big hiccup repairs. All the repairs that we've been doing have just been cosmetic in nature for the most part. But there's one element of this house that has become clear to Mandy and I that the previous owners just really didn't know what to do with it. And what's surprising to us is it's actually the feature of this house that is the reason why we wanted to buy this house. And it's our basement. It's become clear to us that our basement was something the previous owners just didn't know what to do with because, well, they didn't do anything with it. The first indication of that was that it's just a concrete floor that had been painted on. That was it. We also took off the trim down there, and when we've taken off the trim in every other room in the house, you can see layers of paint of what it used to be painted in that room throughout the years, but in the basement it's just white. That's it. It doesn't make a lot of sense because those of you who helped us move in, maybe you remember, if you go down to my basement, there's an absolutely beautiful brick fireplace down there. And so when Mandy and I did our walkthrough of this house, that basement is ultimately the reason why we made an offer. Because it was such a nice basement. So it's become clear to Mandy and I that our previous owners, they viewed that basement as more of a problem. But Mandy and I, we saw it as an opportunity to do something absolutely incredible. And we've been working very hard at that, and right now my lower back is feeling that work, to make it better. I'm not done yet, so I'm not showing you pictures yet, but just, it's been so incredible to both of us to see just what a few small changes have made such a huge difference in that area. We're in the process of making it, if I do say so myself, a really cute basement. A nice, comfortable place for our family to just enjoy. But the previous owners viewed it as a problem. We saw it as an opportunity. Sometimes that's what it takes, right? It's just somebody who can look at a problem just the right way. Who can see it not just as a problem that is too big or too expensive to solve, but can see it as an opportunity to do something incredible. It can actually flip the script on the whole situation entirely. It can take what is ultimately something that most people would look at and say that is a bad situation, and it can turn it into something that's, oh man, that's awesome. That's incredible. It's why in the corporate world, so many employers are starting to try to train their employees to not come to them and say we have a problem, but intend to say the phrase, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity for growth. It's the reason why they do that. There is logic and there is some thought processes behind that specific thing. So if your boss has said that to you and you said that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, hopefully in your brain, they're doing that for a reason. It's because when you say something is an opportunity, it begins to spark that imagination. It begins to get your brain working on ways that we can fix this, ways that we can create a solution, ways that we can approach this as not a problem, but an opportunity. And I think that Jesus was actually trying to convey that to his disciples in probably one of the most well-known texts of Jesus' ministry. But the disciples themselves likely missed it, and I'm going to guess that you've missed it too. It's a story that I'm certain you're familiar with. I mean, it's one that's been told 100 different times. I've personally read it at least 1,000 times. I'm guessing you've heard that. I remember as a kid doing a coloring book page on this particular narrative, but it's in Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21, and it's maybe the most well-known solution to a problem that Jesus ever came up with outside of the cross. It's one that is even known beyond the walls of the church itself, to where even a lot of people on the street know a little bit about this story, because the solution was just so spectacular that it's bound to grab your attention. But again, you may miss the lesson that Jesus has for his disciples there. So let's read through this particular text and let's see if you can catch up on it. So if you got your Bible or if you got your app, open it to Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. And let's see what we see. I love that sound, by the way, the turning Bible pages. That's a top 3 sound for me. Just after the wings are ready. All right. I'm kidding. Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 13. Here's what it says. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Up to heaven and said a blessing. And then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. They took up the 12 baskets full of broken pieces left over. Those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now there is just a metric ton in this particular passage that we need to unpack. But the first thing I want to draw your attention to is really the very first words of the first verse of this narrative. Because it says, "Now when Jesus heard this," hopefully this will spark a question in your mind, especially based on what we've talked about in the last 4 weeks here, about looking deeper into what the context is, because maybe the question that you need to ask yourself is, what is the this he heard about? And really, this is one of those handful of times that I love it when it comes to looking at the context of what Scripture has to say, because we don't have to go very far. All we got to do is go up about 12 verses and read what's going on here, because the this that they're talking about is that Jesus has just learned that Herod has killed John the Baptist. Jesus and John the Baptist had a very special connection, and it's a connection that went all the way back to when both of them were still in the womb. Mary, the mother of Jesus, went to go visit Elizabeth, the mother of John, whenever she found out that both of them were experiencing a miraculous conception, albeit completely different miracle, right? Ladies, if you've experienced pregnancy in your life, you probably know that probably didn't feel very good to Elizabeth in the moment. She probably wasn't real happy she didn't share her child's joy. How about that? But even on throughout their lives, John and Jesus continue to have a special connection with each other. John was the first one to recognize who Jesus is and what his message was. In John chapter 1, verse 29, it says, "The next day he saw Jesus coming toward him and said, 'Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin to Jesus.'" Now John is dead. And so Jesus has what is maybe the most natural, I'll even go so far as to say maybe the most human reaction to this news that there is. Jesus wants to get away, someplace quiet, have a time to mourn for John. He's just received some devastating news, and he just wants to get away for a little while and kind of process this and think through this and remember his friend and remember the guy who was there for him when he needed him. So he gets away, and he and the disciples, they get into a boat, and they sail away headed towards just this. Jesus does, people talk about it. They learn about it. They hear about it. And this crowd of people who are hearing that Jesus is now going away to a desolate spot, they follow after him. Matthew actually goes so far as to say they followed him on foot. I want to remind you of two things really quickly. Again, Jesus is going away to a desolate place, meaning that there's not much around it, meaning that the likelihood is there's not too many roads, not too many pathways to get to the spot that Jesus is going to. I also want to remind you that this is incredibly rocky, rough, rigid, and even dangerous terrain to be trekking. Yet, thousands of people say it's worth it. They're so hungry to hear more from Jesus, to see more of the signs and the wonders that they've heard about, and maybe some of them have seen. And even though it's dangerous, even though it's probably not the smartest choice in the world that they could be making, follow after him anyway, to the point that when Jesus gets off the boat, again, trying to find a quiet spot to mourn the loss of his friend, instead he sees thousands of people waiting for him. Now, if it was me, I'd probably, that'd be understandable, right? Like, Jesus isn't being mean about it. He's just simply saying, I want some time to mourn my friend. Instead, Jesus sees this crowd of people who are hungry to hear more from him, who are hungry to see what he's got to offer. And Matthew actually says that he is moved with compassion. How could you not be, right? And so Jesus does maybe the most Jesus-y thing that there is. Even though he wants to have this time to himself, he serves. Even though he came here to have just a moment for himself, he ends up serving this crowd of people by healing their sick. In Mark's recounting of this particular narrative, in Mark chapter 6, Mark actually includes the fact that Jesus also began to teach them. And so Jesus is teaching, and he's healing, and he's doing all the Jesus-y stuff that we expect, right? Keeps going. For hours. Hours of teaching. If I go for a little over a half an hour, you start thinking it's a hostage situation. But Jesus just keeps going. He keeps teaching them over and over again, expounding more about the kingdom of heaven and about the joy of knowing his Father and about being able to be reconciled with God. He keeps going, and at a certain point it starts to shift from a hunger to learn more about Jesus to just plain old hunger. We're in a desolate place. We are miles from the nearest village. That means we are miles from the nearest place where we can go and get food. This is an unrelatable problem for us in 2025, right? We can just whip out our phones, open up an app, and we get a delivery from any restaurant. Thousands of people who were hungry to hear from Jesus are now just hungry. The disciples decide to bring this to Jesus' attention, right? They come to Jesus and they say what we read in verse 15. It says, "Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away into the villages and to buy food for themselves.'" This is one of those moments that it just shows the practicality of the disciples, right? I think you guys know me well enough to know by now, I really like practicality. I like things that are practical in nature. But it's here. It's here where I think Jesus is trying to teach his disciples, and by extension you and I, something incredible. But I think we miss it. And I think the disciples themselves likely missed it in that moment. Because Jesus responds in verse 16, "They need not go away. You give them something." Try to see this thing going on. They tried to come up with a solution, but the solution they had was awfully meager. It wasn't a lot. And yet Jesus was able to take that and miraculously multiply it to the point there's leftovers. For over 5,000 people. Again, the text actually said there's 5,000 men besides women and children. The likelihood is that most of these guys have probably brought their whole families here. So on the low count, we can probably estimate there was at least 15,000 people. That's a lot of mouths for 5 loaves and 2 fish. So Jesus does this spectacular multiplication of food to the point that everybody gets full, there's leftovers afterwards. And so we get hung up on that point. That we look past first to see a problem that's taking place, but to work towards a solution for it. To not just see an issue in the fact that this crowd is hungry, but to find some way to feed them. All the disciples could get their heads around was, this is a huge problem. There's thousands of people here and they don't have any food. We got to get them out of here so they can get some. And instead Jesus said, "You feed them." They wanted to find some way out of this problem, and instead Jesus showed them to look for an opportunity to serve the people that were around them. It's not hard for us to see problems. Right? You probably just take a quick glance around this room and see a few problems, right? You need to look beyond Lexington to be able to find problems and pain and hurt and suffering and hardship in the lives of the people that we are around every single day. What if we took the approach that instead of viewing them as problems, what if we looked at them as opportunities to serve? What if we looked at them as an opportunity to serve the people around us, to show them the love of Jesus in a very real, a very authentic, and a very tangible way? What if when we saw the problems right here in Lexington as an opportunity to show our community that we love Lexington is not just a cute slogan, but it was our actual heart, it was our actual mindset? Imagine the difference that could make in the entire world around us. Imagine the impact that Lexington Church of Christ could have in our community. If we look at... That hurts, I know. I'm saying it in love, though, I promise. We see these problems, we see these issues, and instead of seeing them as an opportunity to serve, instead we think this is somebody else's problem. What if instead we engaged our imagination just a little bit and tried to come up with some sort of a way to use this opportunity to serve? But I can hear you already. I can. But Brandon, I don't know what to do. Brandon, I think these problems are too big. They're too overwhelming. I can't figure out a way to make this work. And I get it. I get it. There are so many issues, there are so many problems that surround us that how do we even begin to make an approach? And then, even if we can, what if all we can do is something so small, something so insignificant practically? I got a feeling that when the disciples came to Jesus with only 5 loaves and 2 fish, said, Jesus, we looked, this is all we got. In fact, the verse itself actually says, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Only. How in the world is that supposed to feed over 5,000 people? But here's the thing. They made an attempt to come up with a solution. It was small, it was meager, it was clearly not going to work, right? But they tried. And they brought even their most modest of solution to the feet of Jesus himself. And what did Jesus say? Ability, because he is God, to take even our modest, our most meager, our lamest attempts at a solution, knowing that our heart behind it is still looking for a way to serve, and he's able to take that and grow it exponentially bigger than we could ever know. Then we get to watch as God does something awesome with that. I find it fun that Alan quoted 1 Peter, because we're going to close with 1 Peter today. Thanks for doing all the legwork on the context for me, buddy. Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10, and we're going to close with it this morning. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace.